Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to our final class in our course on the Pauline letters. And today we're going to look once again at a series of non-Pauline letters as we continue to treat the New Testament more broadly. We're going to look at the Catholic letters, these letters that are written more generally to a general audience, at least a more general audience than Paul's letters are. We're going to look at them at least in a summary form. We're here in Seattle, off the beaten path a little bit, the furthest flung Major League ballpark. It just seems like a good place to conclude this course. Looking at our agenda for today, we can see we're simply going to go through James, then 1 Peter, and then finally Jude and 2 Peter. Let's look briefly at the 7 Catholic letters. We're not going to talk about the 3 letters attributed to John because they'll be a topic of our Johannine course next semester. But James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and Jude each have their own points that we're going to look at in a little bit more detail. Let's begin with the letter of James. I'm going to prescind from the diachronic questions here because with all 4 of these letters, there's simply more questions than answers. There's traditional attributions to the named apostles. Most scholars believe it's more likely than not that they are pseudonymous, although James and 1 Peter, it's possible that they could be written still during the apostolic age, at least before AD 70. But we don't really need to go into all of that because it doesn't much affect the interpretation that we have of these letters. Let's look first at how James speaks about the law. We pick up in James chapter 1, verses 22 and 25. Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deluding yourselves. But the one who peers into the perfect law of freedom and perseveres, and is not a hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, such a one shall be blessed in what he does. Do you notice the affinity with the Sermon on the Mount? Blessed in what he does sounds like the Beatitudes, and the emphasis on the law. Matthew 5:17 tells us that not even the smallest portion of the law should pass away. James and the Gospel according to Matthew have a special affinity. Indeed, the word law occurs 10 times in James, and it's used favorably. So this is a notable contrast from what we see in different parts of the Pauline letters, where the picture is more mixed. In James, the law is something good and holy, kind of like how it is in the Gospel according to Matthew. Indeed, if we were to chart the different New Testament authors based on how they conceive of continuity between what we now call the Old Testament and the New Testament, we can see Matthew and James are at one side of the story, and John and Hebrews are at the other side of the story, with Luke, Acts, and Paul somewhere in between. James is also famous for its faith without works is dead position. That's in chapter 2. There's a little more to it, though, than that. As we look later on in chapter 1, we see James talk about a subject that gets surprisingly little attention in the New Testament. The word religion is not common, but it is used 3 times in these 2 verses. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, his religion is vain. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Again, don't you just hear that Matthean voice kind of in there? Matthew 25, the parable, the judgment of the nations, caring for the least of these, keeping oneself unstained by the world. I hear a little bit of the Matthean emphasis on persecution in the Beatitudes. I just can't miss that. But notice here, for James, religion is a good thing. Much of the Catholic teaching, speaking of the virtue of religion we hear in medieval theology, is influenced here by James. This idea that if we're going to be faithful to God, we must not simply think, we have to do. Faith requires both an internal assent as well as external activity. Thus, it is rightly said that James cannot be said to conflict with Galatians and Romans. They both portray faith more comprehensively than sometimes people want to give either credit for. Let's go ahead and move on now to 1 Peter. 1 Peter reads a bit like a baptismal catechesis, almost mystagogical in its approach. Let's pick up a couple of passages from chapter 2. 1 Peter says, "Rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, insincerity, envy, and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for pure spiritual milk, so that through it you may grow into salvation, for you have tasted that the Lord is good." This line, "like newborn infants," the first word of that in Latin is Quasimodo infantes, the first 2 words in Latin rather. That's the beginning of the entrance antiphon on the second Sunday of Easter, the octave day of Easter, which is one of the reasons why that Sunday is, among other names, called Quasimodo Sunday. Of course, influenced the movie years ago, Quasimodo and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. This idea here that as baptized Christians, we're called to be different. We're called to grow into salvation. It's powerful that baptism changes us, our faith changes us, but we need to continue to mature. Mature into what? 1 Peter continues, "Come to him, a living stone, rejected by human beings, but chosen and precious in the sight of God. And, like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." Notice here, this has a broad application. We're not talking about what later Catholicism would call the sacrament of holy orders. Here we're talking about the baptismal priesthood. You hear this in Lumen Gentium from the Second Vatican Council. This idea that the church is composed of a common priesthood of the faithful. And the church here is likened to a spiritual house, a building, an edifice, but not just any building, a building where sacrifice is offered spiritually to the Father through Christ. So notice this portrait of the church is complementary to what we read famously, among other places, in 1 Corinthians and Ephesians, where we see Paul's theology of the church developed in a little more detail. Finally, let's look at Jude and 2 Peter, two letters we do well to read together. Most scholars believe that Jude was written first and then 2 Peter borrowed from it. If we compare the argumentation, there's an unmistakable affinity, and actually it's even more than what you're seeing on your screen. I excerpt this just so it fits on one slide. Both of these letters reference the angels and how when they rebelled, they were punished. And it's used to argue why Christians must remain firm in opposition to false teaching. Besides this similar argumentation against false teaching, we also see some compelling theological argumentation. Picking up in Jude, verse 3, this is a very, very short letter, only has one chapter. "Beloved, although I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I now feel a need to write to encourage you to contend for the faith that was once for all handed down to the holy ones." Notice here, like we saw in the pastoral letters of Paul, the faith. This idea of a faith, a fides quae creditur, an objective content that is transmitted to the holy ones, sometimes translated the saints, once for all handed down. That is so interesting. Hapax is the Greek word there for once for all. Handed down once for all. So from the perspective of Jude, doctrine has been transmitted once for all. There was a singular moment of transmission. So perhaps as a reference to the apostolic age, this single, what later generations would call the deposit of faith, bequeathed to the believing community. So it's just interesting how in the first century here, we have the faith being spoken of as a doctrinal deposit that is transmitted. Lastly, we look here at 2 Peter, which makes a reference to the Transfiguration. It's the only reference to this event outside the Synoptic Gospels. We read in 2 Peter chapter 1, "We did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we had been eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received honor and glory from God the Father when that unique declaration came to him from the majestic glory. This is my Son, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased." So here, 2 Peter takes that tradition where Peter, along with James and John, beheld the Transfiguration. Here it's transmitted to emphasize the difference between Orthodox Christian doctrine from this heterodox doctrine that 2 Peter is written to oppose. There is just so much more in these New Testament letters. I hope you'll choose to go deeper with them on your own and indeed make it a lifelong project of understanding all that the Lord has given us in this sacred text. Until we meet again for another course, read well and pray well.